Federalism. What is federalism? The definition: a political system in which several states or regions defer some powers. Federal system is a system of government where all authority derives from the people. The federal system is a lot like an upside-down pyramid, with the federal being the top with the most amount of power, the state following with the second most, and the local with the least, the smallest part of the pyramid. Enumerated powers. Definition: powers specifically assigned to the federal government. The Founding Fathers feared a national government that would overstep its bounds, so it took care to only allow the national government very specific powers. So basically, the enumerated powers are the national powers, things that are specifically lined out in the Constitution of what our national government is allowed and not allowed to do. Reserved powers. Definition: all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government system are to be reserved or saved for the state governments. One important clause that keeps the reserved powers working is the full faith and credit clause, which ensures that judicial degrees and contracts made in one state will be binding and enforceable in another, thereby facilitating trade and other commercial relationships. For example, a state's refusal to honor the same-sex marriage contract poses interesting constitutional questions. States can vary considerably on social issues. Reserved powers is also the power to the people. Concurrent powers. Concurrent simply means at the same time. So therefore, the definition of concurrent powers is the powers that both the federal and state governments have simultaneously. Basically, this is the area where the government system overlaps. Implied powers. Definition: powers that are not specifically delegated in the Constitution, but are understood to be necessary or allowed. Basically, implied powers are just common sense, rules that don't need to be said but are known that are there. The 10th Amendment. This is the final part of the Bill of Rights. It defines the basic principle of American federalism. It says that all powers that are not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This is where the state government does have power. The makers of the Constitution put this amendment in the Bill of Rights because they feared that the national government would become a tyranny, and this amendment would prevent that. The 17th Amendment. This amendment made senators directly elected by the people remove their selection from the state legislature. With senators no longer directly accountable to the state legislators who elected them, states lost their principal protectors in Congress. Coupled with the 16th Amendment, this amendment paved the way for more drastic changes in the relationship between the national and state governments in the United States. The Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause. This clause states that Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution for the foregoing powers. These powers derived from enumerated powers, and the Necessary and Proper Clause are known as implied powers. These powers are not stated specifically, but are considered to be reasonably implied through the exercise of delegated powers. Basically, this gives our government leeway to do certain things when it's not specifically said in the Constitution, which is why it is known as the Elastic Clause. Supremacy Clause. This clause mandates that the national law is supreme to all other laws passed by the states or any other subdivision of government. For example, in 1920, Missouri sought to prevent a U.S. game warden from enforcing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which prohibited the killing or capturing of many species of birds as they made their annual migration across the international border from Canada to the parts of the United States. Missouri argued that the 10th Amendment, which reserved the state's powers to legislate for the general welfare of its citizens, allowed Missouri to regulate this hunting. But the court ruled that since the treaty was legal, it must be considered the supreme law of land. This goes to show that when there are controversies between the states and national government, the national government will be proclaimed supreme law. As we said before, the national powers, which are the enumerated powers, are powers for the national government. Some of these powers that they have include making coin money, conducting foreign relations, providing for an army and a navy when declaring or conducting war, establishing a national court system, and making laws necessary and proper to carry out the foregoing powers. Concurrent powers, which are the powers that are shared between the national government and state power. Some of the things that they can do are taxing, they both can borrow money, they both can establish courts, they can both make and enforce laws, charter banks and corporations, and they both control the spending money for the general welfare of their people. State powers. These are the reserved powers. These are the powers that only the states are allowed to do. Some of these powers include regulating elections, which include setting the time, place, and manner of elections. They ratify amendments. They exert powers that the Constitution doesn't delegate to the national government. They establish local courts, and they regulate commerce within the state. The McClellan v. Maryland court case. This is probably one of the most famous court cases. It was tried in the Marshall Court in 1819. Although the word bank cannot be found in the Constitution enumerates the power to give Congress the authority to levy and collect taxes, issue currency, and borrow funds. From these enumerated powers, Marshall found it was reasonable to imply that Congress had the power to charter a bank, which would be considered necessary and proper to exercise its enumerated powers. So basically, this gave Congress the power under the Constitution to incorporate a bank. Gibson v. Odkin. This was tried in the Marshall Court in 1824. In this court case, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress' power to regulate interstate commerce included the power to regulate commercial activity as well, and that the commerce power had no limits except those specifically found in the Constitution. So basically, the court's decision was that Congress had the authority using the Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate interstate commerce. This brings us to our conclusion on federalism. We just briefly brushed over the topic of federalism, but you will learn a lot more from Ms. Campbell. We wish you the best of luck.